Welcome, adventurers, to about the halfway mark of the class comparison video series, where we compare two similar classes in Pathfinder 2nd Edition and see how they stack up against each other. Today, we will be looking at the buffing and debuffing classes of the system, the Bard and the Witch. Why these two? Well, both were updated in the remaster. I think the Bard has always been quite a strong class, but it did get even better in the remaster. The Witch definitely suffered beforehand, but I think is quite a viable and I would dare say very exciting class now. They are both spellcasters. We won't spend a ton of time talking about that, but we will talk about their unique cantrips, the Bard composition cantrips and the Witch hex cantrips, as well as their unique focus spells, which are just called Bard compositions and Witch hexes. And we will also cover the differences between these two classes. Before we dive in, I do want to take a moment to please ask you to like, comment, and subscribe on this content. At the time of filming, I am just shy of the magical 1,000 subscriber mark. So if you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, please click that subscribe button and help me get over that very important benchmark. All right, let's get going. First, let's start by talking about buffing, and in order to do that, we will start with the Bard. The Bard uses composition cantrips to inspire those around them. You can also debuff, but we will talk about that later. The Bard really does have, I think, the most classic buff in the game, Courageous Anthem, which used to be called Inspire Courage. This will grant all allies within a 60-foot emanation +1 to their attacks, to their damage rolls, and to saves against fear effects. If you want to know what I think about Inspire Courage, check out my Bard deep dive video, but needless to say, I think it is pretty fantastic. It's easy to use, it can be stopped and restarted, it can be extended, and it's often the single bonus that your team needs in order to survive an encounter. Bards can also pick up many other buffs as they level up through class feats. They pick up more compositions, more composition cantrips. These can include things like the Song of Strength, Uplifting Overture, and Rallying Anthem. They can also protect allies with their initial focus spell, Counter Performance. Whenever you or allies have to make a save against an auditory or visual effect, you use a performance check to counteract that and can extend that check to your allies. So if someone else fails, they might actually succeed because you succeeded. So imagine something coming around the corner and roaring or screaming and trying to terrify you and the party. As a bard, you can actually step in and intercept that. And the Witch does have something pretty similar to this called hex cantrips. Again, they are cantrips. You can use them as often as you would like. The old version of hex cantrips had a really bothersome rule where after stopping a cantrip, the target was immune to the effects of it for 1 minute. So if you in round 1 wanted to buff an ally, you would start, and then maybe round 2 you didn't have the action, so you had to stop. But then round 3 you wanted to buff them again. Well, you couldn't under the old rules because they were immune to a minute. Thankfully, that has gone away, and you can stop and restart these hex cantrips just like you can the Bard's composition cantrips. There is a bit more variety in them, but some of the ones I want to talk about in the terms of buffing are Stoke the Heart. You are going to give one designated ally +2 to their damage rolls. You've got Nudge Fate, which can actually change the outcome of a failed saving throw, attack, or skill check. And then Discern Secrets that can give an ally a free action to recall knowledge, seek, or sense motive. I should also mention that both the Bard and the Witch can offer some protection and healing to their allies as well. I already mentioned the Bard Counter Performance, which is a form of protection. And then as far as the other protection and healing go, they're very similar for each of the classes. The Bard can use Hymn of Healing, which will provide fast healing to an ally, and the Witch can pick up Life Boost, which also provides fast healing to an ally. The Witch can then learn the focus spell Blood Ward, which will give an ally a +1 bonus to their armor class and saving throws against a particular type of creature. And the Bard can learn Rallying Anthem, which gives, you guessed it, a +1 armor class bonus and a +1 bonus to saving throws, but that is to all of the allies. And here we get into some of the differences between the Bard and the Witch. Let's first talk about how the Bard's Courageous Anthem and Counter Performance, which I talked about earlier, are core class features. This means that all Bards have them. The Witch's Hex cantrips that I've mentioned so far are actually determined by their patron, which is their subclass, so not every single Witch will be buffing allies, and there's going to be more variety in the gameplay of your Witch characters. And another huge difference is that these Bard abilities we've talked about, for the most part, are emanations that will affect all allies within reasonably all allies ever, because most are a 60-foot emanation, which is huge. Meanwhile, the Witch's abilities are single target focused. I do think that this means that overall, the Bard is going to be the stronger team buff player. But I think that the Witch is the stronger debuff player. Yes, the Bard can learn Dirge of Doom at later levels, which is amazing, but that is a later level feat. The Witches have a lot of, not feats, but they're hex cantrips granted by patrons at level 1 that are really good debuffs. You have Clinging Ice that is going to provide some damage, first of all, and then a speed reduction to an enemy. Evil Eye will sicken an enemy. Shroud of Night will kind of make all creatures concealed to an enemy, so that increases their chance of missing their attacks. And then Wilding Word will force a penalty on rolls to attack or harm you. So lots of debuffing abilities that the Witch has available to them at level 1. As you level up as a Witch, you can learn new focus spells, new hexes, via Witch Lessons. These are class feats. And these are really good at debuffing as well. You have Elemental Betrayal. That will make the target weak to a certain element, so it is great to use in conjunction with elemental damage. Needle of Vengeance is another cool one that will force some mental damage onto the target who attacks you or an ally of your choosing. And then Veil of Dreams, well, that imposes a penalty to perception, to attack rolls, and to saves on the drowsy target. And yes, these debuff abilities of the Witch are single target, they are not emanations, but I think that's actually quite okay, because usually your party size outnumbers the number of enemies. So it's a really good idea as a Witch to start with a particular enemy and sort of designate that as the one that your party should be attacking. You can debuff them, making them a really easy target for your squad. Alternatively, you could maybe let your team deal with a particular enemy while you greatly slow down or harass the other one, making them ineffective so that your team can kind of focus here while you are taking this other enemy out of the fight. Either way, I know that if I wanted to play as a debuff primary character, I would definitely choose the Witch. All right, so that was a lot on the buffing and debuffing abilities of these two classes. Now let's talk about their general magic, because they are both full spellcasters. There's actually not too much to say about these two in this regard. There are some differences. Yes, the Bard is a spontaneous caster, and the Witch is prepared. For a bigger explanation of that, check out my Sorcerer versus Wizard video. I won't go into the full explanation of what that means in this one. Otherwise, I don't know, they both have cantrips, they each have spells, so there's not really a ton to note here. Though there is something very important to note about the spellcasting abilities of these two classes, and that is that the Bard is an occult spellcaster, whereas the Witch is actually a caster of all of the traditions, depending on your selection of your subclass of your patron. So if you really want to be arcane, divine, or primal, well, then you want to select a patron that gives you access to that list. Bard is just occult, so if you don't like that, you probably won't be playing as a Bard and would want to choose a Witch instead. I think the occult spell list is pretty fun, so it's not a limiting factor on the Bard at all for me, but it is something to keep in mind. So that actually was a fair difference between the spellcasting abilities of these two classes. But when it comes to the martial abilities, there is a huge difference. The Witch is your classic squishy caster. You have 6 hit points per level, no armor training, and just training in simple weapons. Meanwhile, the Bard has 8 hit points per level, is trained in light armor, and as of the remaster, has access to simple and martial weapons. So if you really want to play a Gish character that uses some martial abilities alongside magical abilities, well, the Bard really is going to be your choice. You can have a really good sword in hand or use a bow from range. You can get up close and be protected by that armor. There's even the Warrior Muse, who now inspires courage or uses Courageous Anthem by hitting things. So there is no doubt, if you want to do the spellcasting and the buffing, but also do some melee or some good ranged damage with weapons, the Bard is your choice. So if the two classes have fairly similar buffing and debuffing options, fairly similar spellcasting, but then the Bard is great at martial abilities, what does the Witch have to offer to make up for that? Well, they have familiars. Specifically, all witches have an enhanced familiar even. Familiars typically have 2 abilities that you can select every day. This is if you pick up a familiar as a ancestry or class feat for another type of character. And this can be things like giving them manual dexterity so they can use their hands, or being an ambassador to give you a bonus to diplomacy checks. But the Witch actually has 4 abilities that they can give their familiar. Specifically, it states that your familiar gains 2 additional familiar abilities. One of these is unique ability based on your patron and is always selected, and the other is an additional familiar ability that can be selected by you. I do think this is maybe a little bit more clearly thought of as 3 abilities from the standard pool of familiar abilities, plus 1 ability that is tied to your spellcasting. And that's because, mechanically speaking, this 4th familiar ability of the Witch can only occur once per round when you cast or sustain a hex. And this is a huge new addition for the Witch from the remaster. This wasn't there before. And you know what? It adds further buffing and debuffing options to this already monster of a buffing and debuffing class. As far as buffing goes, you have Faith's Flamekeeper. The familiar will grant 2 plus your level temporary hit points to an ally within 15 feet. You have the Inscribed one. This allows your familiar to be used for flanking, which normally can't be done. As far as debuffs go, you have the Resentment. You can prolong the duration of a negative condition affecting an enemy. There's the Starless Shadow, which I think is really cool. It's my favorite. You can frighten a creature adjacent to your familiar as long as your familiar is concealed, hidden, or undetected. And coincidentally, the hex cantrip that accompanies this does conceal creatures to the target. So it works out really well. And then there are some that are actually both. The Spinner of Threads, you can choose to either buff an ally or debuff an enemy. You can either raise the armor class of an ally or lower the armor class of an enemy. So yes, there are some huge differences between the Bard and the Witch in the end. If you want to be more of a warrior, using some martial weapons, getting up at melee, maybe using a really good bow, the Bard is for you. If you like the idea of having a familiar and using that familiar for some additional teamwork for even more buffing and debuffing abilities, then the Witch is your choice. And furthering the differences between these two classes, we have the roleplay aspects of this. It is important to note that the Bard is charisma-based, they are a spontaneous caster, and this means that they tend to be maybe bold, charming, charismatic, maybe even arrogant or a bit flippant, and you could use that high charisma in your roleplay for diplomacy or maybe even intimidation. Meanwhile, the Witch is intelligence-based and is a prepared caster. This steers them towards being cunning, calculated, studious, maybe even secretive. And remember that familiar of theirs. This is great for roleplay. You have 2 characters, and then you can create dynamics between you and your familiar, and even between the 2 of you and your patron. And I think it's really cool that there are these 2 classes who arguably have fairly similar mechanics, at least in their buffing, debuffing, and spellcasting abilities, but very different roleplay and flavor. You could almost decide which role you want to play in your party first, like say, I want to be the character who buffs my allies' attacks, and then pick either the bard or the witch, not strictly based on mechanics, but on the flavor and roleplay abilities. In conclusion, these are both, as of now, very good buff-debuff classes in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I am so glad we got a very serious overhaul of the Witch in the remaster, which made this a fair comparison video because honestly, it really wouldn't have been beforehand. I really do love the Bard, and I still think I would say that is my favorite class, but I absolutely would be excited to play as a Witch now, especially if I wanted to lean into debuffing. What about you, adventurers? Is anybody else out there as excited as I am about the remastered Witch? Or what about the remastered Warrior Muse for that matter? Let's talk about it in the comments. Until then, remember that when you are playing as either the Bard or the Witch, always remember to annoyingly remind your party members that they only succeeded because of your buffing abilities. I know my squad loves it when I say, hey, you only made that hit because of Courageous Anthem, the Bard.